The two leaders met on the sidelines of the Summit of the Americas, the first substantive talks between a U.S. president and Cuban leader since President Eisenhower's encounter, also in Panama, with pro-American dictator Fulgencio Batista in 1956. President Obama called Cuba's presence at the summit an historic occasion. After denouncing decades of American imperialism, Castro offered this.
That I am very emotional when I talk about the revolution. I apologize to him because President Obama had no responsibility with this.
President Obama would have America believe that time is far overdue for us to create a better relationship with Cuba, and that despite the island hammering away at its population for decades, denying them simple civil and human rights, despite the fact our own State Department lists their government as one of only 4 global state sponsors of terrorism, Iran, Sudan, and Syria being the others, we need to shake hands and come out smiling with Raul Castro. So then the simple question is he right? And if not, why is the president so mistaken? Our guest is Professor of Government at American University and also co-author of Back Channel to Cuba, The Hidden History of Negotiations Between Washington and Havana. Welcome back, Professor William LeoGrande. Professor, pleasure to see you again.
Good to be with you again.
Let's go right to an article that you had recently, or an interview rather, that you were involved in, where you said removing Cuba, and you said this on NPR, from the U.S. terrorism list would be mostly symbolic. That flies in the face of what so many critics here are saying, that it absolutely has to stay because it has some real teeth to it. Explain if you could, please.
Sure. There are financial sanctions that attach to countries that are on the terrorism list, but the reality is that those sanctions are actually not as stringent as the economic sanctions under the U.S. embargo against Cuba. So even if Cuba came off the terrorism list tomorrow and the terrorism list sanctions went away, the embargo sanctions are still in place. And so it doesn't really change the economic sanctions picture very much. It's symbolic in the sense that Cuba has always felt insulted by this designation. They haven't felt like they've ever supported terrorism, and certainly not now. And so it's been for them a real point of pride to get off that list.
When we look at support for state terrorism, because you pointed out there are about 70 fugitives from the United States in Cuba, I think perhaps there might be a misconception, because when we hear that, there are many people who believe that what you have is Cuba sending troops, sending military, sending goods, sending money to other countries to support terrorism in other places around the world. They're not able to do that, are they?
No, they haven't done that since 1992. When the Soviet Union disappeared, Cuba really lost the capacity to project military force off of the island. And so now, actually, what they've done instead to bolster their own diplomatic standing is to send medical workers, doctors, nurses, medical technicians, and so on, a kind of shift from hard power to soft power, if you will.
Is there not, though, and this is what a lot of the critics are into, if you even open the door just slightly with Cuba, then you are basically giving them a win. You are giving them perhaps maybe one day access to the U.S. banking system with the Cuban embassy in Washington. I think people are afraid that what you're doing is you're still opening it up to a government that is in many ways communistic and, again, I pointed out, very harsh on their own people between human rights and civil rights.
Well, Vietnam is still a communist system. China is still a communist system. We've found a way to coexist with those two countries in a way that makes sense for the interests of the United States. And frankly, Cuban diplomats ought to be able to go to the bank and have a checking account. I mean, that's just part of the normal operation of having diplomatic relations. And in fact, there are international agreements that govern this kind of thing that really require us, if we're going to have normal diplomatic relations with Cuba, to provide them with those kinds of services.
Your book talked about the back channels between the United States and Cuba over the years. What would be your guess as to what is happening now in those back channels that we are not privy to on a day-to-day basis?
Well, I think that our State Department officials and their Ministry of Foreign Relations officials are continuing almost a constant dialogue at this point around the issues that are still standing in the way of normalizing diplomatic relations. And also we know that there are working groups of experts talking about some other things like the restoration of postal service, expanding civil aviation links, counter-narcotics cooperation, and so forth.
Let me ask you, though, because you've had a lot of experience here, and a very simple question. Is the president right, then, when he says that it's time to basically create those better relations with Cuba and get over ourselves over the last several decades where nothing has worked?
Well, I think he is. And I think, you know, for the critics who say that this policy won't work, I think the answer is that, well, the policy of hostility and trying to coerce Cuba into behaving, we tried that for 54 years. It didn't work. It didn't make the human rights situation there any better. It didn't really serve the interests of the United States. And so this is a new approach, an approach of engagement. It's not very different, really, than what we and our Western European allies did with Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union during the 1970s and the 1980s. So we ought to give it a chance and see if it doesn't show some success.
Wouldn't it be smart of us, though, right from the very beginning, to push hard on human rights, to push hard on civil rights, the things that if you listen to the people who have left Cuba at any time in the last 20, 30 years, even longer than that, they will tell you simply don't exist. So shouldn't we put as much pressure as we can on this nation? You want us? This is the cost.
Well, I don't think the president has backed off on pushing the issue of human rights and democracy. He said after the summit that in his one-on-one meeting with Raul Castro that he emphasized to Castro that this was going to continue to be an emphasis of the United States and that we were not going to back off of it.
One of the things that's interesting, too, is Senator Marco Rubio. He will announce for president tonight. On Saturday, he made some comments about all these overtures towards Cuba, called the thaw with Cuba ridiculous. He said it doesn't make any sense. So this leads people to believe if the president cuts a deal before he leaves, would it be reversible if somebody like a Marco Rubio got into office?
Well, it could be. All the things the president has done thus far, he's done on his executive authority as president, and a new president could roll all of that back. I think it would be difficult, though. The position that President Obama has taken has been so popular among our Latin American allies and our European allies that to reverse it would do a lot of diplomatic damage to our relations, not just in the hemisphere, but really globally.
I have to ask you, because with your knowledge of all this, with about 30 seconds to go here, do you get the sense, too, that a lot of younger Cuban Americans, ages 40, 30, and 20, they want this over with, they want to move ahead?
Oh, there's no doubt about it. I mean, we've got polling data that goes back a number of years that shows that younger Cuban Americans born here, or Cuban Americans who came from Cuba more recently, want to stay in touch with their family on the island. They want to travel back and forth. They want to send remittances. And so for them, a normal state-to-state relationship is a good thing, not a bad thing.
The book, once again, is A Back Channel to Cuba, The Hidden History of Negotiations Between Washington and Havana. And Professor LeoGrande, we thank you so much for your time. Good talking to you as always.
You too.
All right, take care. A Democratic senator in hot water, but other corruption charges based on factual misconduct are rooted in dirty politics of Washington. We'll cover that when we come up next, right here on MidPoint.